Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, one of the very first reactions I ever did was to OverSimplified's American Revolution. Well, that was a really old video. It's several years old now, and the quality is not that great. And I took it down a while ago, wanting to be able to go back and revisit it. And I've been having a lot of people lately ask me when I'm going to get back to it. So here we are. We're going to take a look at OverSimplified American Revolution Part 1 today. As always, the link is in the description. I'm assuming by now that everyone has watched OverSimplified's videos. If you haven't, I'd encourage you to watch their video first so they can get that view and everything and support, and then come back and watch me to get a little more information. I'm not just here to react and say wow and holy cow and things like that. I want to add information, fill in the gaps, give you a little bit more of the story behind what's going on here. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm really in a mindset of the American Revolution because I'm going to be speaking for an organization this weekend. I'm going to be doing a presentation on some of the early campaigns of the revolution. So I'm excited to be in that headspace right now. So let's go ahead and dive in.
Holy smokes. Christopher Columbus, that is no way to address the King and Queen of Spain. What is wrong with you? Okay, so you know how we're looking for a new trade route to India, right? Right. And the Earth is round, right? Right. So I'm thinking we can just sail the other way around the planet, right? Yeah. So I set sail, right? Mm-hmm. And I reach India, right? Right. Wrong.
So right off the bat, great points to make here, which is number one, this idea that I think a lot of us grew up with, that Christopher Columbus was the one who somehow had this revolutionary idea that the earth was round, is nonsense. The Greeks knew the earth was round long time before this, thousands of years before this, in fact. The issue for Christopher Columbus is he thought the distance was much shorter than it really was. He miscalculated that, and he thought it would be much quicker to go west to get to the east.
I did not reach India. I did not. All right, get to the point. Did you know there's a whole nother freaking continent out there? Okay, and do you think I should care about this? Why? Oh, I'm sorry. Did I forget to mention there's gold everywhere? Gold? Columbus landed in Central America in October 1492, and he had the time of his life. And by that I mean he went on a huge theft and murder spree. He stole gold, jewelry, people, and a hammock. And then he returned to show off all of his riches, including a few previously undiscovered items, such as tobacco, the pineapple, turkeys, and a hammock. Now I know what you're thinking, but oversimplified, Columbus didn't discover America, the Vikings did. And you'd be partially right. In the 11th century, Leif Erikson was the first European to land in America. But hey, if you love Vikings so much, then why don't you check out today's sponsor?
Nice. So, there's a lot of debate to this day about how much credit do we really give to people like Christopher Columbus. And the point is that, yes, we know now that the Vikings did have presence in North America, up there not too far from Greenland. But we can still acknowledge Columbus because his landing at Hispaniola and then all the other areas that he ends up landing, including on the mainland, is what really opens up North and South America to Europe. You know, did they find it sooner? Yeah. Had that been forgotten, or was that something that really wasn't on people's radar? Also true.
And suddenly the race was on to explore and conquer the New World. After a couple centuries of warring with the natives and each other, the European powers had claimed quite a lot of land, including this area, which both the English and the French claimed as theirs. One day the French said, "I'm going to build some forts along here." And the English were like, "Could you not?" And the French said, "Sorry, but no, I could not." And they went ahead and built their forts, which pissed off the English, so they sent an up-and-coming British lieutenant colonel by the name of George Washington with a combined force of British troops and Native Americans. After a short battle, the French commander said, all right, we surrender." "Okay, boys, pack it up. They're surrendering." Oh, sorry, was I not meant to split his head open with the tomahawk? Don't worry.
Yeah, basically, George Washington can be blamed for what becomes in North America, the French and Indian War. That's what we call it here. It's the North American part of a larger war called the 7 Years' War that's going on over in Europe.
It's not like this will start a 7-year-long major global conflict. And what happened next was a 7-year-long major global conflict, which Great Britain won. At the peace negotiations, Spain gave up Florida, while France gave up all of its territories in North America.
And another really interesting thing that happens in the early stages of all this is something that's been known as the Braddock Expedition, and the defeat of that expedition is known as Braddock's Defeat, and it happened just east of Pittsburgh. I've actually visited the site. I've got a video from there, but it was really early on, and I want to go back and revisit that. But in that expedition, you've got George Washington, you've got Thomas Gage, who's going to be the first British commander in North America during the Revolutionary War. You've got Charles Lee, who's going to go on to be one of the prominent American commanders. Daniel Boone is there. It's really quite something. All of these people who are going to later on be big players on the revolution stage.
But Britain's victory came at a cost, a £60 million cost. They were now broke, in a lot of debt, and had to come up with some way to repay it. So they went to the colonies and said, okay, listen up. So a huge part of the war was spent protecting you from the French, and now we have no money because of it. So I'm not sure what you're saying here. Okay, so we spent a lot of money protecting you from the French, right? Right. And now we're broke. That certainly is a pickle. Listen to me. We spent all of our money protecting you, and now we need money.
Perfectly reasonable for the British Crown to expect the colonies to pay their fair share. They did provide troops, some colonial forces to help out, things like that. George Washington is one of those forces. So it's perfectly reasonable to expect them to pay. And honestly, I don't know how much of this, I think we overblow the tax issue more than we probably should, because there were other things too. It's not so much the fact that they were taxed, but maybe so much how they went about taxing them.
Can you please pay us back some money? No. Okay, we're just going to go ahead and tax you. In 1764, Britain introduced the Sugar Act, forcing the colonists to import sugar and molasses exclusively from the British and to pay duties on them. Then a year later, they introduced the extremely controversial Stamp Act, and it worked a little something like this. Hello, shopkeep. Hello, Mr. Bungleberry. Here's the deed for your new shack. Stamp. That'll be 3 pence, please. Wait, what was that? It's the new tax. I get a stamp on any paper or documentation I make, and you have to pay for it. Would you like to see this pamphlet that explains
Stamp
everything?
Act
Yes,
and
please.
you.
Okay. Stamp. 2 pence, please. This is awful. You know what? Just give me a deck of cards so I can go gamble my pain away. Okay. No. Don't do it.
True.
Stamp.
100% true. There were stamps on playing cards, but again, they needed to raise the money. That's a fair assessment of the situation. I think what ticked off the colonists was the way they did it. For example, taxing things that then the colonies were forced to buy from the mother country. But listen, if you're Britain in this situation, it probably doesn't come across as unreasonable to you that your colonies, which you set up and you supported and you financed getting off the ground, are then going to be asked to pay their fair share and to buy things from you. So you can definitely see both sides of this. And I think there are times when we patriotic Americans think about the British being this tyrannical government who forced all these oppressive taxes on their people, and it really wasn't like that at all.
Obviously, the colonists were like, hey, my dudes, this new tax legislation right here, this is BS. Until now, they had enjoyed relative freedom to rule themselves, and now suddenly Britain was asserting its control. They were especially unhappy because they didn't have any representatives in the parliament that was levying taxes on them. So they protested. Orators gave fiery speeches. British goods were boycotted, and anyone loyal to the British found themselves increasingly harassed.
And, things like tarring and feathering, it seems like just an embarrassing thing to have happen, but it was really quite painful because the tar was really hot. You see kind of a portrayal of that in the HBO series John Adams, where a guy gets tarred and feathered, and you see really how horrible it could be to do that to somebody. So it was more than just the embarrassment, though that was certainly a factor. But yeah, here, taxation without representation is where you're going to have the real sticking point. They're saying, listen, at least give us some seats in Parliament if you're going to levy taxes on us. But again, they're colonies. They're not full-fledged members of the British, so you can kind of see both sides.
The whole thing actually began to take quite a toll on British business, and after just a couple years, the British were forced to repeal the Stamp Act. But we still desperately need money. What should we do? We could try taxing the colonies. Great idea. Wait, didn't we literally just try that and it failed miserably? Man, look at me. I look fabulous. Have you ever seen such a handsome boy?
So George III is part of a relatively new dynasty. He's a pretty young guy at this point. He's going to be one of the longest serving monarchs in British history. He's on the throne from 1760 all the way to 1820. Now, the last quite a few years, he's dealing with mental health issues from a blood disease, probably something called porphyria. But he's part of the dynasty of Hanover. And he's actually going to be the first king of I think he's the first king of Hanover when Hanover gets elevated to king status. And then he's got 2 sons that follow him and then his granddaughter Victoria. But yeah, Hanover is German. And George III is the great-grandson of George I, who's the first Hanoverian king. And he's German. He doesn't even speak English. So for large parts of England's history, England, Great Britain, and eventually the United Kingdom at the end of his reign, they're ruled by people who don't actually speak the native language. First French, then German. So George I, George II, and then George II is the grandfather of George III.
No siree, Georgie. No way. You're the handsomest, smartest, most popular king that ever lived, and everybody likes you. You're doing such a good job. Your Majesty? Oh, you're still here. Get the hell out. So in 1766, the British made a declaration saying, we can do what we want because we're in charge and you can all go suck it. Then they levied a whole bunch of new taxes on the Americans via import duties. Glass? There's a tax for that. Lead? There's a tax for that. Paper? Tea? Oil? There's a tax for that. And once again, the Americans boycotted British goods, British business felt the pinch, and the British had to back down. Alright, this is ridiculous. They're my colonies and I have to be able to assert my control. Repeal all the new taxes except for the one on tea. Also send 1,000 troops to Boston to take control. Oh, and make the colonists pay for them.
And house them as well. And so you can start to see how the tension is ramping up a little bit at a time. And neither side's backing down. The British back off of some things and they think they're being reasonable. But it's not enough for the colonists. The colonists are starting to get a taste of what it would be. They've had a taste all along. They've had, like they said, they've had kind of the ability to fairly govern themselves. George Washington, for example, is going to be a part of the Virginia House of Burgesses. So they do have their own local governments. And because Britain's so far away, they're kind of doing their own thing. And so now when Britain starts to assert more and more control, they're going to react by pushing back more and more, and eventually something's going to happen that's going to crack. And it's just a series of things over a better part of a decade that build up. It's not like the revolution just broke out one day.
And as British troops arrived, the tension in Boston was palpable. You could cut it with a knife, and it was all about to come to a head. On March 5th, a band of local patriots began heckling a British guard at the customs house. More and more Americans joined in the heckling, while more British troops turned up in support of their comrade. Snowballs were thrown at the British. The snowballs turned to rocks, the rocks to oyster shells.
All really important to note, okay? This was not a peaceful crowd. And listen, I know that I'm sounding like I'm really taking the British side here, but the British made plenty of mistakes too. The reason I'm focusing so much on pointing this stuff out is because I feel like, at least for us in America, we've only ever been given one side of this, that the Americans were patriots, that the British were tyrants and evil and terrible and needed to be dealt with. So if I'm overcompensating for that, it's to try and present a more balanced view of all of this. This was something that was absolutely provoked by the crowd. You've got armed British guards protecting government property, the State House, and you've got this mob that's getting increasingly restless, and you've got a ramping up of tensions. These are probably young soldiers. It's only going to take one little mistake, one little jumping of the gun to set it all off.
Soldiers, outnumbered, panicked. One thing leads to another, and you can see where this is going.
And there's actually a testimony that at one point they actually hear someone behind them, the British soldiers do, saying, "Fire, fire, damn you." And there was a fire that was actually going on in that area of Boston at that time. And so some people argued, well, maybe it was just people that were actually yelling fire because there was a local fire that was happening. So it's all very confusing, and it's all really hard to get to the bottom of.
Civilians were killed. The Patriot press throughout the colonies declared the Boston Massacre an unwarranted crime committed against the people of Boston by the cruel British.
Yeah, and this is all about propaganda, right? And Paul Revere is going to make one of the early propaganda moves with this, and this engraving showing the Boston Massacre, when it was 5 people who were part of a mob that were egging on British soldiers, and they fired. And it's all going to be a good way to look at this is look at the fact at, number one, the British soldiers were found not guilty in the deaths, and they were defended. Their defense attorney was John Adams, a fervent patriot, one of the guys who's going to be one of the leading voices opposing the British. Even he saw this for what it was.
And the anger continued to grow. A British revenue schooner that ran aground in Rhode Island was burned by the locals. When it came to light that the governor of Massachusetts supported the suppression of the colonists, his house was burned by the locals.
Yep.
And next, the colonists would set their sights on the remaining tax on tea. On December 16th, 1773, a band of patriots known as the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Native Americans, marched down to Boston Harbor, boarded a British merchant ship loaded with tea, and in front of thousands of spectators, threw nearly 10,000 pounds worth of tea overboard. The British were disgusted, and they punished Massachusetts with a vengeance.
Quick, drink the tea. Yeah, and they actually still have, I believe, a couple of those tea chests are actually, like, they still exist. You can see them. And you can actually go down into Boston, and there's something they can do, like you can do as a kid. And you can go to the site where the Boston Tea Party happened, and your kids can throw chests of tea overboard. They're attached with ropes so they can pull them back in and do it again. So again, you've got a ramping up of the tensions. And so now how are the British going to respond to this? Burning down government property, destroying tea, like $1 million or more worth of the stuff, tarring and feathering government officials. What do you do if you're the British government? Well, you react by sending in the troops. You send more troops, and eventually you're going to actually blockade the port of Boston. You're going to put martial law in place, and the people who were already mad about stuff that was far lesser than that, they're just going to get even more mad, and it's going to just continue to ramp up the tension. It's like when you get into an argument with somebody, you have a choice to either bring it back by calming down, or you want to shout louder than the person who's shouting at you, and then they shout louder to get above you, and it just goes until somebody goes to blows.
They dissolved its General Assembly, revoked their charter, and sent 3,000 more troops to occupy the city, meaning Boston and Massachusetts were now essentially under the direct rule of Great Britain. And oh boy, were the people pissed. The other colonies saw what was happening and worried they might be next, so they called a brain trust to decide what to do. 56 delegates from 12 colonies gathered and met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress, and the roll call read like a who's who of America's finest thinkers. I'm talking lawyers extraordinaire Johnny A. and Johnny J., experienced military commander George Washington, businessman and future alcoholic beverage Samuel Adams, fiery orator Patty A.
And Sam Adams is a part of the Sons of Liberty. He's one of the more extreme members of the Continental Congress. He's going to be one of the first ones that wants war. He's going to be one of the first ones that calls for a violent revolt to overthrow the British. You've got people like Patrick Henry who are much more vocal and actually are going to come to actually oppose the direction that the U.S. government goes with things like the Constitution.
Guy who married a rich lady, Big J. Dickinson. And while they weren't present at the first Congress, soon names like James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and much later Alexander Hamilton would all serve time in the Continental Congress. Yeah,
but people like Alexander Hamilton, he's not a part of any of this. He's going to be a part of the Constitutional Convention, which at this point is still like a decade and a half away. So some of these guys are going to come much later on the scene. Alexander Hamilton at this point is a college student in New York. He's like 19, 20 years old. He doesn't know any of these guys. And he's going to end up being an artillery captain. He's gonna command this group of artillery men, and he's gonna kind of first get on George Washington's radar screen during the retreat from New York, and then of course into the Battle of Trenton. And it's only in 1777 that Washington is going to put Hamilton on his staff, and that's when Hamilton's going to begin to rise to prominence.
The question now, though, was what to do about the British. After much bitter debate and disagreement, they eventually agreed on an amazing solution. They would simply ask the British to stop. Can you stop? No, it didn't work.
So it's called the Olive Branch Petition, and in the fall of this is before that, I guess. I'm getting a little ahead of myself.
Okay, then tell the local militias to start arming and be ready at a minute's notice. And across the colonies, these Minutemen stood ready for the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. Now, having your colonies in open rebellion is one thing. Once they start arming themselves, that's when it really hits the fan. Yep. So British General Thomas Gage ordered...
So again, think about it. Here's Thomas Gage. Served alongside George Washington, although Washington's not on the scene yet as far as the military goes. But Gage is the commander in North America. And again, put yourself in the position of the British government. You are sending troops to kind of restore order to one of your colonies, Massachusetts. And now you hear that the colonies are starting to gather arms and ammunition and supplies. Well, what are they doing that for if not to rebel against the government? So we've got to be proactive. Let's go get the weapons and let's round up the ringleaders, guys like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams, and let's get them before they can incite an all-out rebellion, and this is where it's going to crack.
700 troops from Boston out into the rebel-controlled Massachusetts countryside to destroy stores of arms and ammunition held by the rebels in Concord. The British set out in the middle of the night. Patriots, including Paul Revere, rode ahead to warn that the British...
he glosses over that, but Paul Revere absolutely looks like Jack Black. I mean, look at him. Let's pause it. Does he not look like Jack Black? As much as Alec Baldwin looks like Millard Fillmore and Tommy Lee Jones looks like Andrew Johnson, Jack Black and Paul Revere definitely a lot in common. Paul Revere is a silversmith, which is why you see him holding silver there, but he also dabbled in some other things, including dentistry for a while.
Including Paul Revere rode ahead to warn that the British were coming, giving the
They didn't say the British were coming. Why would they not have said that? Well, because they were British too. The most common phrase that I've heard, and if you go there to places like Lexington and Concord, they'll tell you that what Paul Revere and Dawes and these other guys were shouting was, the regulars are out, the regulars are out, or the regulars are coming. They wouldn't have said the British are coming, because that would have been like me running through the streets of my town saying the Ohioans are coming, or the Americans are coming. Well, we're all Americans.
rebels time to prepare. The two sides met in Lexington as the sun began to rise. They faced off against each other, and in the confusion, somebody shot first. The shot heard around the world.
Not the shot heard around the world. And if you go there, again, to Lexington and Concord, and I highly recommend it, there's a ton of history, there's so much to see there, and there's like the whole route from Lexington to Concord, and it was in Concord where the shot heard around the world was fired. Is all this just historical sites after historical sites. There's incredible houses. You can go to Lexington Green where those shots were fired. But the reason that that's not the shot heard around the world, the people there will tell you the shot heard around the world was at Concord at the bridge, because that was the first place that Americans were actually ordered to fire on British soldiers. That's where the real resistance happens, because what happened at Lexington was a bunch of Americans gathered there. Somebody fired a shot. The Americans had been told not to fire. There was an order given to them that basically said, listen, don't fire first, but if they mean to have a war, let it start here. But they didn't fire. They weren't ordered to fire. The British fired, killed 8 Americans at Lexington. They're all actually now buried under a monument at Lexington Green. But Concord is the shot heard around the world. That's where real American resistance happens, and that's where the British start to fall back, and they're harassed and fired on the whole way.
Marked the beginning of the American War of Independence. The rebels were outnumbered and had to fall back to Concord as the British split up to search for rebel supplies. However, more and more Patriot rebels kept showing up.
And they did actually arrest Paul Revere at one point. And while Revere is under arrest up here closer to Concord, before anything happened at Lexington, he hears gunshots. And he's freaking out, thinking, they're going to kill me. They're going to shoot me. And what he heard was that the militia had actually been called out when they first got the warning much earlier in the night, 2, 3, 4 in the morning, something like that. And they all had their weapons loaded. Well, you can't go home with a loaded gun, so you had to fire your guns to unload them. And so that's what Paul Revere heard, was the guns being unloaded by being fired. It wasn't actually anybody being shot.
And this time it was
But he was eventually able to get away.
As more fighting kicked off in Concord, the most professional army in the world was forced to flee back to Boston at the hands of local, poorly trained militiamen. And all along the British route back to Boston, Patriot rebels continued to gather and open fire on the retreating British. When the British reached Boston, the rebel militias surrounded them. Boston and the British were now under siege as small land and naval skirmishes continued around the city.
Think about this. What starts out, put yourself in the position of Thomas Gage. What starts out as you just sending out a battalion or two to go grab some weapons. And the guy, by the way, who was in command, I think his name was Major Pitcairn at Lexington, is going to die a couple months later at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And he's actually buried in a church in Boston, under a church. You send out some troops to go grab some weapons off of some rebellious colonists. The next thing you know, you're under siege in Boston. It's crazy.
And the British would suffer another embarrassing blow, this time in upstate New York. Colonel Benedict Arnold concocted a plan to take the British stronghold Fort Ticonderoga, which held a large amount of guns and ammunition. He set off towards the fort alone, hoping to recruit men along the way, when he came across the Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen, who, as it turned out, had the exact same plan he did. So they decided to work together. But I'm in charge. No, I'm in charge. No, I'm in charge. No, I'm in charge. No, I'm in charge.
And right now you see, here's the immediate problem, right? You've got different organizations, a lot of times they're called committees of safety, which are these organizations that are put together in local communities and in local colonies to figure out how are we going to deal with this. And so they start raising these militias, and they start putting prominent people in charge of those militias, people like Benedict Arnold, people like Israel Putnam, people like Ethan Allen, who some of these people just raise these troops on their own and kind of do their own thing. There's no real command and control structure. And so you're going to have issues like this, which is why the Continental Congress is going to decide to choose a commander-in-chief.
Charge. No, I'm in charge. No, I'm in charge. This went on for some time, until the Green Mountain Boys threatened to go home, and Arnold had to concede. The group raided the fort at night while the Redcoats were asleep, and they caught them completely by surprise, taking the fort and all of its munitions with almost no resistance. Wow, great job, Ethan. Very impressive. By the way, what happened to that other guy we sent to take the fort? Who? Benedict Arnold. Never heard of him. Ouch.
And that is going to be a common theme. Benedict Arnold is a heroic fighter who does some incredible things and probably is more responsible than any other leader for the huge victory at Saratoga, but he's going to constantly be overshadowed by people who take credit for things, and that's going to push him down a very dark path.
What the fuck? Nobody knew what was going on. The colonies were in open rebellion, and for now, they even seemed to be winning. So King George fired General Gage, replaced him with General William Howe, and ordered the rebellion to be put down immediately. Okay.
And William Howe's actually the cousin of the king. William Howe's mother was a half-sister of King George I. So he's a cousin of King George III, and him and his brother are going to kind of tag team this thing. His brother's an admiral of the fleet, and his brother's going to be responsible for the naval forces who are going to transport Howe's army. And so at this point, this is a New England problem, right? Virginia is not involved, South Carolina is not involved, Maryland's not involved, and a lot of the delegates at the Continental Congress from some of these southern colonies are saying, you know what, listen, we're not a part of this. We don't want to be at war with Britain. We just want them to address our grievances. And so they're not at the place where people are ready for independence. People like John Adams, Samuel Adams, people in Massachusetts, they're ready to be done because they've been dealing with this all along. But people in Virginia, Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, places like that, they're not there yet. So they're going to send this olive branch petition, which is basically one last attempt to say to the king, listen, we want to be your loyal subjects. Just give us some things we're asking for and we'll get them to all stand down. And the king's response is basically, our people are being misled by these rebellious leaders. And if they want to return to the fold, we will receive them with tenderness and mercy. But for those who persist in their treason, the punishment will be the punishment that you get for being a traitor.
Okay, the British are definitely going to retaliate for all of this, so we should probably put together a proper army. First, we need to pick a commander-in-chief, and I think we can all agree that that job should go to the man, the myth, the legend, George Washington. My friends, I am humbled and honored that you would consider me for such an important role. I did not expect for this. All right, you've been showing up in a military uniform every day for the last 10 months. We all know you wanted this, so cut the crap, George.
100% true. Washington, he says all the right things, right? He's like, oh, I don't know if I'm up to this task. He tries to be really humble about it, but it's been made very, very clear that he has been wanting this because he shows up in military uniform. He's daily reminding them that he, among all the people in the Continental Congress, is the guy with military experience. But as you're going to find out, Washington, while he's a fantastic leader, he's a great leader. And I don't know if anybody else could have done what he did in holding this all together and winning the war. But he's not a good tactician on the battlefield. That is a huge blind spot for him, and he's going to get beat over and over again with the same tactics. But he's a great leader. He's very good at recognizing talent and putting people in positions to be successful. A lot of times he gets overruled by the Continental Congress, and people he knows shouldn't be in positions of authority are forced on him. But But this is a brilliant move, and it's John Adams who recommends Washington because Washington's from Virginia. Virginia is the largest, the most influential, the most powerful state, and to this point not really involved in the Revolution. And so putting a Virginian in command of these New England militia forces is a way of tying it all together. It's a way of giving the southern states a stake in all of this. It's brilliant.
Dude. uncool. So Washington began his journey up to Boston to take command of the newly established Continental Army, just as the British made their first major attempt to break the siege. They made plans to take the high ground on Bunker Hill, but spies warned the Continentals of the British plans, so they fortified Bunker Hill and set up defensive positions on nearby Breed's Hill. The day of the battle came, and as the British advanced, a barrage of Continental gunfire was opened up on them. Twice they tried to climb the hill, twice they were pushed back.
Yeah, the Battle of Bunker Hill doesn't take place on Bunker Hill. It takes place on Breed's Hill. But everybody thought Bunker Hill was going to be the target, and it just kind of became the name. If you go there today to Breed's Hill, where the battle took place, unfortunately, it doesn't look anything like it did. I've got videos from all these places. I'll put some links down in the description if you want to see my videos visiting some of these sites. I visited Bunker Hill literally the day that schools started shutting down because of COVID. But there's a big tower you can climb to the top of that's on Breed's Hill, and you can actually look back and see, and you'll see in my video, I point to where Bunker Hill is. There's houses over all this whole neighborhood now, so it doesn't look like it once did.
The battle lasted 3 hours until the Continentals finally ran out of ammunition and had to retreat, allowing the British to take the hill. While technically a British victory, they suffered nearly 1,000 casualties to the Continentals' 400. The colonists showed the British that this wasn't just a rebellion, it was war, and they were ready for it. But one thing...
And yeah, so Washington arrives just a couple of weeks after the Battle of Bunker Hill, and now he's going to take command and kind of bring some kind of consolidation to these forces.
They weren't sure about was why they were fighting. While some radicals were starting to throw around the I word, most hoped to eventually repair their relationship with Great Britain. So they sent a letter to King George.
There's
saying,
the Olive Branch
"Hey man,
petition.
Looks like things aren't going your way. Remove the taxes and let's be friends. I'm gonna kick your ass. Send that to the colonies. Your Majesty, your handwriting is terrible. Are you sure? Just do it."
And if you've seen the musical Hamilton, the response to the Olive Branch petition becomes the song "You'll Be Back," which is first sung by Jonathan Groff, and it's really, really well done. And I love Hamilton. So
what does it say? He's gonna lick my... Gross. So for the remainder of the year, small engagements continued to occur around the colonies. The British burned down the towns of Falmouth, Massachusetts, and Norfolk, Virginia.
And you might be looking at the map and say, wait a second, it looks like Falmouth's in Maine. Why did he say Falmouth, Massachusetts? Well, Maine was a part of Massachusetts until well after the war was over. And it's going to get admitted as its own state as part of a compromise to avoid the issue of slavery down the road.
Yeah, as revenge for earlier anti-British incidents. These actions played right into the hands of patriot propaganda. Overseas, the British were seen as brutes, and the French and Spanish would soon begin sending supplies to the rebel cause. During this time, there was also minor fighting going on between patriot and loyalist militias in the southern colonies. Benedict Arnold was still on a mission to win some personal glory for himself, so he headed up an attempt to invade Canada in a two-pronged attack. The Continentals managed to capture some British forts and the city of Montreal, but a harsh snowstorm with some smallpox on the side saw them defeated and pushed back at Quebec City.
And you can see, I mean, think about it. Canada doesn't exist as like Canada is not a thing, right? I mean, there's an area that's Canada, but it's just other separate colonies. And the Americans always wanted to try and get Canada, and that's going to become a war aim again in the War of 1812. They're going to try once again to invade Canada and try to consolidate all of British America as one nation.
They were forced to retreat all the way to Fort Ticonderoga. Speaking of which...
It's probably a good thing to point out, too, that while we all know this flag, the Union flag, as the British flag, I believe at this point they would have been using a flag that looked real similar to this one, but had a solid red field here instead of the stripes. But you notice they don't have the red X here for Northern Ireland yet. But I'm not entirely sure that was the flag that was used at that time.
And pushed back at Quebec City, and they were forced to retreat all the way to Fort Ticonderoga. Speaking of which, remember all those guns and ammunition? Well, this guy's got a plan for what to do with them. He uses oxen to drag 100...
Henry Knox is this 300-pound bookkeeper, or like he owned a bookstore. And it's a small miracle that he pulls these guns across the mountains, and it's what turns the tide in Boston, because overnight these guns just appear surrounding the city, and the British know they've got no chance to hold the city then.
120,000 pounds of artillery for 2 months through the harsh winter, 300 miles all the way to Washington and his Continental Army surrounding Boston. Boom. Washington's got himself some big guns, which is fortunate because up until now his army had been suffering through the cold winter, not knowing when the siege would end. Now they could make a move. Washington wanted to launch a full assault on the city, but his junior officers felt the British were too fortified, and to his credit, Washington Washington was great at hearing and taking on board the ideas of others.
That's true. And there was also a real threat that they were going to burn the city of Boston to the ground. And so Washington has to make a decision. Do we let them destroy this city, or do we negotiate and let them pull out of Boston? We get the city back intact, but the British troops get away.
Instead, the Continentals worked through the night, setting the guns up on Dorchester Heights, overlooking the city. And when dawn broke and the British saw the guns, they knew they were toast. Their positions were completely exposed. It was checkmate. They had no choice but to abandon the city. 120 ships carried 9,000 redcoats and 2,000 loyalists away to an unknown fate. And Washington had his first victory of the war.
Unknown fate, yes, but as I've been doing research for my presentation this weekend, Washington already knew where they were headed. They were headed for New York, because if you're familiar with Civil War strategy, the American Civil War, the Mississippi River, the Union wanted to get control of it, divide the Confederacy in two. Same thing's true here with the Hudson. The Hudson is a really wide river, and it cuts off New England from the rest of the colonies. And so Washington correctly deduced that the next stop was going to be New York City in an attempt to control the Hudson River. And so back in January of 1776, before the siege of Boston is even over with, he sends Charles Lee down to New York City with an order to start fortifying the city, but also to start rounding up any loyalists in the city who might compromise the integrity of the defense. So they're well underway preparing for what's next. And so when the British leave Boston in March of 1776, Washington knows they're coming back for New York.
Washington then moved his army to New York, knowing that when the British returned, they would probably land there. In the meantime, a friendly-looking old man by the name of Thomas Paine had written and published a pamphlet called Common Sense, in which he advocated for total independence from Great Britain. It spread across the colonies like wildfire, and to this day remains the best-selling title in America. It was read aloud in taverns and meeting halls, and brought the idea of independence into the mainstream. Congress began to seriously consider the idea. Thomas Jefferson was selected to write up an official Declaration of Independence, and he went hard.
Kinda. So, June 1776, they're finally pushing toward independence. A committee is formed of 5 men, including Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, to come up with a declaration of independence. In other words, we need to express why it is we're doing this. And on the very day, I think it's June 28th, that the draft of the Declaration of Independence is submitted to the Continental Congress for them to kind of start correcting and approving it, Washington gets word that the British troops are about to land near New York. There's about 30,000 British and Hessian forces, and Washington's got maybe a third that number.
Writing that all men are created equal, with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, Jefferson had over 100 slaves, but we don't have to talk about that. On the 2nd of July, Congress voted unanimously in favor of independence, and John Adams declared that the 2nd of July would go down as the most remembered day in American history. Then a couple days later, independence actually came into effect. The United States...
July 4th is when men start signing it, though men continued to sign it, and the last signings don't take place until the first week of August. But men like John Adams probably did sign on July 4th. But yeah, he wrote a letter to his wife basically saying July 2nd is going to be celebrated for generations with fireworks and all these and parades and all this stuff, because he figured that was the day that people would remember, because it was the day they approved unanimously. It was 12 in favor and 1 abstention. New York abstained, not because they were cowards, but because they were waiting for permission from their constituent assembly, an organization back in New York, their state legislature, to vote and say, this is how we vote, and we're giving you instructions on how you can vote.
Of America was born. There was no turning back now. The Americans tore down a statue of King George in New York and melted him down into 42,000 musket balls. To the British, it was treason. And if the king had his way, Washington and all of Congress would be hung. Speaking of the British, guess who's back? The king sent an intimidating force of 130 warships and 25,000 men to New York. Washington knew that taking on the most powerful military in the world wouldn't be easy. The British set up camp on Staten Island as the Americans dug into defensive positions around Brooklyn Heights.
So Washington's plan, let's look at this here. Washington's plan was to basically make it so costly to the British that it would just be Bunker Hill after Bunker Hill after Bunker Hill, right? So he sets up a defensive line on Brooklyn Heights, and then he fortifies all along Manhattan, figuring, okay, wherever they attack, he wants to try and force them to go from Staten Island and land somewhere on the southern tip of Manhattan and basically fight street to street against all of these barricades and just make it a battle of attrition. But he gets completely outsmarted, and all of these fortifications that they spent months building become completely worthless.
British set up camp on Staten Island as the Americans dug into defensive positions around Brooklyn Heights, waiting for an attack to come. But the British just waited, wearing down their opponent's nerve while...
Not only that, but Howe had been given some permissions from the king and from the government to negotiate with the colonies to bring a peace about. And so he actually meets with guys like Ben Franklin and John Adams. But they don't really get anywhere because at this point the Americans have declared independence, and Howe's limited authority to negotiate doesn't allow for anything like that. But it does buy some time, and it is one of the reasons why it's not until late August until the British actually launch their attack.
Building their own strength. At one point, they launched a big scary artillery barrage and then said, you know, if I was you right now, I'd probably sue for peace. But Washington told them to shove it. The Americans kept holding out for what was coming, and when they finally hit, they hit hard. 15,000 British troops approached the American position, and the two sides fired on each other in massive rows. But what the Americans didn't realize was they were only fighting a decoy. The main British force was going around to flank the Americans from behind.
And this will not be the last time this happens to George Washington. He gets beat by this strategy several times. It'll happen again at Brandywine. It happens other times too.
And when they arrived, they inflicted heavy casualties. The Americans panicked and retreated back to Brooklyn Heights, where they then found themselves trapped between the British army and the river. It looked as though the war was already lost, but luckily, instead of attacking, the British decided to dig in for a siege, and then a thick fog set in, allowing Washington's army to escape across the river unimpeded. The British continued to chase and engage the Americans at Manhattan, and the Americans suffered defeat
at Kips Bay. Remember, Washington's strategy is to fight through the streets, right? But the British surprised them by landing much further up here than they were expecting. They land at Kips Bay. The Continental Army basically just runs. And this is when Washington, who's famous for his temper, will ride along and just is indignant. And he will say at one point, "Are these the men with which I am to defend America?" He's just beside himself. And he's just going to get completely wrecked on Manhattan, back to Harlem, back to Fort Washington. He's going to lose a big chunk of his army, and he's basically going to be left with just a couple thousand men.
To chase and engage the Americans at Manhattan, and the Americans suffered defeat after defeat after defeat. It was a disaster. Washington's leadership was called into question, as thousands of American POWs were left to rot as traitors. Washington's army fled through New Jersey all the way down to Pennsylvania. Rarely had an army been so badly beaten, yet survived to fight another day.
So, yeah, and so that's the point at which we're going to get the low point. And I mean, you know, a lot of people talk about Valley Forge, but Valley Forge is not the low point for Washington. The low point is the fall and early winter of 1776. The United States declares independence, and everything militarily falls apart at almost the exact same time. And Washington basically has very little of an army left, and that's when he's going to pull a miracle out of his hat at Trenton and then again at Princeton. But we'll talk about that in part 2. I put some links down in the description if you want to check out some of my visits to some of the places we talked about here. And we'll be back tomorrow with part 2. Thanks for watching.